Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. I was recently at the wedding where the father of the bride said that he hadn't taken down any notes because when you speak, you should speak from your heart. And it really resonated with me. Then I thought, I'm actually speaking at TED, so I better structure something here or there. But what I want to talk about, and particularly tacking on from the last presentation as well, is the power of story within a change and how, in essence, my story and how I try to reconcile my own career with change outside of London, outside of Britain, and predominantly in what we know as frontier markets. Now, frontier markets are sort of the fourth tier or the most actively growing parts of the world. They're predominantly Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the sort of cases where you hear on the news and you switch on to the next channel because we've heard all about disaster stories from that continent. But instead, what my contention has always been, and the way I've always approached things to be, is that instead of looking at something as a challenge, it's about finding the opportunity. And the opportunity within the frontier market space now is one of the most profound and dramatic in the global economic system. Particularly after the last 5 years of credit crunch, the whole world is reinventing itself and asking itself, what can banking and finance bring to the table? We hear stories every day about bankers, spins for the past two centuries about bankers being greedy, corrupt, holding on to the leverage cycle, sort of hoarding development all for themselves. But what I wanted to ask myself is that how do you reconcile that stereotype with where banking funds and banking finance can make a huge and profound impact in the lives of people everywhere? For instance, to start with a classic example, in Uganda, every day 300 people die of malaria. Malarial diseases are one of the most profound in that region of Africa because of the tropical nature over there. What we have tried to do at TLG and in consortium with a lot of local partners is actually work with Ugandan corporations, Ugandan investments, and look at ways of developing and building an African solution to an African problem. For instance, the last 4 years ago, Uganda, particularly just outside Kampala, we had the first premier pharmaceutical facility, manufacturing plant, producing antiretroviral HIV drugs and malarial drugs for the use of people in East Africa. So as opposed to importing it from India, now local Ugandans are being medicated and treated from drugs that are produced in their own country. That's one of the changes that we look at trying to get through in Africa, in the African region. One more interesting statistic is that in the last 5 years, the sub-Saharan economies are now more correlated with Asian economies than with the West, reflecting the growth of Asia and the influence of China and India in the African subcontinent. What I would say over here is that led to me and my team and my company thinking about perhaps there's a way for us to think about how we get into this great story, about how Asia and Africa sort of intermarry, and how can we work on developing that link. And that's another great theme that we look about, the transmigration of technology. It's not only about what we in Britain are able to do, but how is the rest of the world connected to each other? And for instance, the Ugandan plant, while our firm is based in Britain, the corporation that helped with the technical know-how, with the manufacturing prowess, was all from India. One of the great stories right now is the role that India will play as a tech and pharmaceutical powerhouse in helping Africa catch up. And that's what we're looking at, so to speak. I think when we talk about health and when we talk about development, we don't realize that, for instance, Africa has 25% of incidence of global disease, yet only 2% of disease funding is diverted to Africa. The simple reason is that the world, or rather certain aspects of our global elite don't seem to think the African consumer is ready to purchase healthcare products. And unfortunately, unless the consumer market and the consumer class is built, there's no way you're going to divert and direct investment to that region. And that's what we've been very strong, focused on building. How do we actually create and cater the African consumer, and what role do we have as multinationals and investment forums? And for instance, in Ghana, to give another example, before, when Ghanaians had cancer, the first recourse that they would do is go to a hospital in London or New York, because there were no good local cancer facilities in Ghana itself, in fact, in the whole of West Africa. So when they wanted complicated treatment for their cancer diagnoses, they would have to go abroad for it. Within the last 5 years, led by a Scandinavian team, the first local Ghanaian cancer hospital was built, can service 100 beds, and there's also an ethical dimension to it as to all of our projects. So a certain aspect of those beds are actually free and are reserved for those most in need. But now, in fact, instead of traveling to London or New York, a lot of Ghanaians are able to use and make use of facilities in Accra itself. What's even more interesting in both these cases, in both Uganda and both in Ghana, there's a very high degree of international cooperation. In fact, neighboring countries now, people from neighboring countries, instead of also going abroad as they were before, are now going to Ghana to get treated. Those are the sort of stories that we don't hear enough about. We seem to think that somehow it's a black hole, and that it just requires constant development and NGOs. Everyone has a part to play, and no one can deny that. I think it's very important to realize it's a sustained and consistent effort. But what I prefer to do, and what has always been my style, rather than opt for change, is rather opt for growth. And how can we use our know-how and our skills and somehow make the story of the frontier markets and the developing world exciting? And it's not, health is a very complicated industry. It's not only somehow that there's a developing world and developed world divide. For instance, infant mortality is 3 times higher in Singapore than in the United States. Yet the United States spends the equivalent of UK's GDP on its healthcare budget. So it doesn't necessarily mean that every problem has to be dealt with by throwing money at it. Rather, what we need to think about is, how do we get to an effective solution as quickly as possible? To go back to an earlier example with the Ugandan pharmaceutical plant, the transition time was estimated to be 5 to 7 years, that the local workforce would be able to supplant the foreign workforce. What is extraordinarily surprising is that that timeline was hastened, and in fact, the local Ugandan workers were able to replace their international counterparts in 2 to 3 years. Those are some of the stories that actually take you by surprise, and you realize there's actually a narrative within the narrative, that all is not doom and gloom. For instance, another project that's extraordinarily interesting is that in Monrovia, Liberia, the only family clinic to survive the civil war is now one that we're in partnership with. And now it's in its wake and in its track and in its ability to attract Western investment. There are now 5 more family clinics in Monrovia. That's obviously still not enough. But the story is that instead of just thinking about disaster, how do we actually facilitate that sort of real level and concrete growth? And that's what we're constantly trying to somehow look at those opportunities. And unfortunately, in finance, everything has to have a commercial angle. And that's what we're also trying to see, is that how do you reconcile that sort of ethical outlook with a much more commercial focus that is able to attract a wider investment forum. Speaking from my experience in banking as well, and when I was sitting as a trader, one thing I realized is that unfortunately there's a total detachment, and this is why rightfully the trading floors have attracted such hatred, is because there's a total detachment between what the markets are looking at and the reality of the human condition. And unless those two, unless finance has a way, or the entire financial industry has a way of humanizing its efforts, of trying to demonstrate what exactly it's able to do to serve the wider society, it's an industry that will always be on the defensive footing. And I think if we're looking at a story for change right now, the real change that we need to look at is that within the United Kingdom, we have the City of London, the square mile, that is a huge reservoir of capital, know-how, talent, and skills. And particularly as the world is shifting from a more Western focus, economically speaking, to a more Eastern and a Southern focus, we have to think within ourselves, within Britain as well, how do we engage with this tidal wave from West to East and South? And there will be more firms that will start to look at Africa, and particularly from Britain as well, we need to ask ourselves that instead of just thinking locally or parochially or resisting outsourcing, we have to also say, what can we do to reform our own economy to once again be able to become competitive and enticing to foreign capital? So change on a lot of levels is actually more supplanted by a slower story of growth and progress. Obviously, it doesn't catch the same sort of headlines or taglines or interest as, say, something about dramatic change. But then I was reading a book on Africa. It's called The State of Africa. And it's one of the most interesting books I've ever read. And in every case, it was tracking the development and the plot of the African countries and African economies. And it demonstrated that whenever there was a need for dramatic change, the consequences were never actually positive. In most cases, like in virtually all cases, they were just negative downsides to it. So the story is instead that development has to be a long-haul process, and that rather than ask ourselves that somehow we need to go in and just change the way we think, rather it's about actually accepting our circumstances, accepting the static nature of society sometimes, and then when there's the opportunity to strike and make sure that we're able to facilitate what we need to do. If you had asked me 5 years ago, would I have been in this focus in frontier markets? My answer would have absolutely been no, because I was happy where I was. But then after the credit crunch, which no one could have predicted, then my own ideas about the world began to change. And I had a catharsis as well that said that rather than just work for a desk or for a seat or for a computer, there had to be some more meaning to what I was doing and some way to apply what little I had learned to a wider world and to a broader context. And that's my story so far. And I think what's the most important thing as well, it's not an individual story. The real heroes about this narrative aren't here to speak about it because they're actually busy working, building hospitals, building pharmaceutical plants, maintaining those institutions. And there's so many other investment projects that we're now getting pitched to every day that it's amazing to see an entrepreneurial class rapidly develop in the continent, which had been suppressed for the last 3 or 4 decades. In fact, one of Africa's largest problems is that, for instance, small, medium enterprises, which form half of all GDP in the United Kingdom. Half of all GDP in the United Kingdom are small firms. In fact, in Africa, it's only 10%. The issues with that is that small firms are the engine for growth, innovation, and trends in any society. When you have such a low proportion, and instead you have multinational mining corporations or very small 1 or 2 persons outfits that are informal, up to 90% of business in certain parts of Africa are in the informal sector, which means they aren't registered, they're still in the black economy, and they're actually dead capital. So what we need to think about is that how do we facilitate the growth of small, medium enterprises in the continent? Because ultimately, and this is something I believe in very firmly, any solution has, as we see over here, it's local speakers are coming here to speak. Any solution needs has to be locally derived. Problems cannot be solved from outside. No matter what we do, it cannot have an external solution. It has to be the people themselves who have the tools and the ability to actually come up and interact and engage and reform their own environment. And ultimately, that's my story of change. And I'm willing and constantly trying to learn about what other stories of change would be. And that's my career path so far. So thank you all very much.